Kristal Media Podcast Network.
Welcome to a very specific conversation today on the growing local leadership in the area of technology in Brunei Darussalam, as well as the governance and the improvement of that in terms of our digital infrastructure. A lot of big technical words, but today we will unpack that with our friends from Comquest, Sindhya and Berhad. So today we're joined by Mr. Gaurav Shrotriya, and Gaurav is the General Manager of Comquest, Sindhya and Berhad. Hi Gaurav, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And to Gaurav's right, we have Amalina Daud. Amalina is the Director of Business Development with Comquest, Sindhya and Berhad. And in a nutshell, Comquest has been around for a long time, a truly established name, and even more so now, as they are renowned for truly being one of Brunei's leading ICT providers, with a strong focus increasingly on digital transformation, cloud, which we'll talk about today, some AI, as well as some very significant business process outsourcing. Those are some crunchy details there. So Gaurav and Amalina, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
The conversation today kicks off on that celebratory note. In November of 2025, you successfully launched the Amazon Web Services AWS Outpost, in brackets, hybrid cloud in Brunei. I had to do a lot of Googling. So we're going to unpack this for all of our listeners out there. There is something in this for everybody. Oh, Gaurav, back to the basics. For anybody who's been hiding in a server room or has no idea what this means, share with us exactly what is AWS Outposts and why should Bruneian companies, Bruneians in general, care about this?
Sure. Thank you, firstly, for having both of us here. It's interesting, as you rightly put it, right? The launch of AWS Outposts in Brunei is truly a milestone. Now, what we are trying to achieve is, imagine yourself wanting a Michelin star restaurant food in your kampong, right? And then having to figure out where is the nearest Michelin star restaurant. Maybe it's in Singapore or some other country, right? Maybe not yet in Brunei, right? And wanting that to be delivered to your home. Now, what we have done is equivalent of that with respect to Amazon Web Services. We have brought all the services that Amazon Web Services offers in Singapore and other countries and brought them to Brunei, which means you do not have to figure out a way to get those services access from Singapore. So this is, in a nutshell, what we are trying to achieve. Now, how it translates to businesses in Brunei, to the public sector in Brunei is, we firstly get a lot of data sovereignty, which means the important critical data that the Brunei government or the Brunei businesses want to keep within their shores stays in Brunei. Second thing, a lot of the dependencies that the companies may have, which may be, let's say, related to internet facilities, internet link between Brunei and rest of the world, now we kind of insulate that dependency because our data will be hosted here on AWS infrastructure. Another important aspect of this is, because the infrastructure is from AWS, it is fully managed and I'm loosely using the word underwritten by AWS, which means AWS as a global company is going to manage it, working along with us. So we think that, all of these factors put together will give a lot of reliability to the Brunei's national digital infrastructure.
And also, we are familiar with the global brand of Amazon. So already there, we have a nice gateway in. Thanks, Gaurav. I picked up a few keywords there. The importance of maintaining our sovereignty over our data. That's a security issue. It's very helpful for government as well. I also picked up on Ferrari. We'll talk a little bit about the actual level of this whole experience and service as we get into this conversation. Amalina, so as we've launched now one of the very first fully managed outpost services in Brunei, as we've spoken about, this is much like bringing a Ferrari to a kampong road. Let's go into a little bit more about that. How ready were we for this ultimate gold star of standard and service in terms of this kind of infrastructure? So I guess we'll go with the analogy of bringing in a Ferrari to the kampong road. Share more about that whole experience of how you prepared Brunei for this.
I think in terms of bringing a Ferrari to the Kampong Road, there's a couple of ways to look at this. I would say the traffic is already there. So what I mean by that is like the demand that we're seeing is there from, and we can see that from Brunei's digital roadmap. They require data sovereignty, low latency, and compliance to certain standards. So with that, we're trying to cater to that demand. We're bringing in managed services for one. So that means that the Ferrari is coming with the pit crew. So those businesses, they don't have to worry about the intricacies of how the cloud works. They are getting managed services from day one, and we're partnering with them to help bring that to. You can scale to the amount that you require.
So, okay, let me just go step by step. So currently, AWS is a cloud system. So globally, we all tap into this cloud system, which is something we can't have oversight locally. Now, with the Outpost solution, we can now have access to this infrastructure and manage all of our data ourselves.
True.
Why is that so important again in terms of the big picture of how does that solve a problem?
There are a few ways how it solves the problem. One, I already spoke about data sovereignty, right? So you're keeping the data in country, right? Let's assume critical infrastructure information, any information which is very sovereign to the country. So first stays there.
So currently, any information we have which is sensitive, because we're on the AWS, which is globally accessible, means it's not secure. Anybody can have access to that.
Not necessarily like that, because a lot of the companies will manage their own data centers, right? So they'll keep the data there, so it is still safe. I don't want people to understand that currently the data is not safe.
Yes.
Data is absolutely safe as long as it is within their data centers. But it opens up a lot of vulnerabilities, right? For the global malwares, for a lot of attacks that we keep hearing about, right? Cyber attacks and all of that, because there is a resource constraint that any of the institution will have. How much resources can you pour into safeguarding yourselves from cyber attacks? How much resources can you pour into in terms of having number of resources, people to manage it, right? But the moment you transfer this responsibility, which sort of in our parlance we call it as shared responsibility, you're giving some of that headache away to AWS, who has the global might to manage these things much better than any of us, right? So what we are trying to do is sort of a hybrid setup. We are bringing the AWS's global scale, global infrastructure, global capabilities in the local setup, right? So that's a very important factor of why we thought this is important. Now, another factor why companies would be interested in this. Today, let's say a company like yours would have so many IT systems and things to manage. You would need a lot of people. The folks who are managing their infrastructure will have sleepless nights thinking about, when is the next patch I need to update? What could be the next upgrade that I need to do? All of those things keep a lot of IT folks alive and drinking a lot of coffee, yes. Right? So, and any vulnerability that comes in either through a cyber attack or let's say the global giants updating their software, right, becomes a huge nightmare for anyone to manage. With AWS, that responsibility gets shifted to AWS. They monitor and manage the system 24/7. So the IT folks have to just look at what's happening overall. They don't actually have to execute those things because that responsibility is now managed by AWS, right? So the resources that we have here in Brunei can now focus on other value-added applications and work rather than just going after the trivial IT infrastructure management. So that's something that we are trying to achieve.
So in terms of Comquest's role, you've now partnered with AWS. You're the bridge between AWS and the businesses and the governments in Brunei. So you are the in-between and you'll provide that managed service,
True.
Which helps us to drink less coffee.
Yes.
Everybody can benefit from that. Okay, True. I'm slowly grasping this. That was clear. I appreciate that, Gaurav. So in my mind, I just think of it being something which fills up a room with server rack after server rack. We've also spoken about Ferrari, which indicates there is an element of speed there. Tell me why our image of what this means is incorrect. It's not just a room full of racks.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. That's one of the first things that customers that we have been engaging with think of, that, this is another piece of metal with lots of racks stacked up. Now, the same thing applies to AWS. Right? It is not just buying the hardware, it is what comes along with the hardware, which is the very critical component of running any hardware, right? Today, there are enough companies in the world where you can go and buy hardware boxes and stack up everything with racks. What they do not give is the managed services, is the peace of mind of not having to run behind these situations which come in unannounced,
Yes.
right? Where people have to run around and figure out what's happening, or your applications are down. Imagine if it's a critical application, right? So all those things are then managed by AWS. So in the Ferrari example, you are not actually buying a Ferrari. You're actually buying Ferrari as a service, which comes along with its engineers, with spare parts, with everything as a bundle.
So all that a Ferrari can do. I'm picking up on some keywords here. Amalina, you mentioned earlier on, as we spoke about the Ferrari in the road, latency. What is that actually? What does that mean for people who are tuning in and don't know what that means? Latency. So, for example, somebody may say, and something I would never say because I don't understand it, please, Comquest, take away my latency problems. Will this be a solution for them?
Okay, so I think when we talk about latency in this context, it's it's really speed. So it's having your servers as close as possible to you. And so if your servers are closer to you, the speed at which information travels is a lot faster.
It's a physical thing.
Yes.
It is a physical thing.
Yeah.
So if I can just elaborate on what Amalina said is, for a lot of people, when they visualize this, it looks like internet is lightning fast, right? So why should this be an issue? Where latency becomes very important is when you're managing huge applications with huge amounts of data, terabytes of data flowing in, right? We don't feel latency when it comes to websites, right? Because they are very light and very little information is exchanged. But when it comes to huge workloads, which there are of many in Brunei, latency becomes an important factor, right? Imagine you are into, and I'm just making a hypothetical example, you're doing an important medical surgery or something of that critical nature, right? Every millisecond, every second counts, right? There, if you are, let's say, uploading a report and you're expecting a response back, if it's taking longer than you expect, that's very critical, right? So this is where latency becomes very important. The second factor where latency becomes important is when these applications have to work with various other applications, not in silos, right? Where they're all connected to each other, right? That is where latency again becomes important, because the data has not just to flow from point A to point B, it has to go from A to B to Z and back to B, right? So every millisecond just keeps adding up. Now, with having outpost racks in Brunei, you're cutting down that physical distance that data still has to travel.
And I think when you mention how critical that is in certain industries, healthcare being one, you can really see how latency will play an issue. That could literally be a life or death situation.
Sure.
And that is purely dependent on latency.
Sure.
I got that. I understood that. So in terms of busting some myths, Gaurav, some people may say, and I'm going to quote some just common beliefs, hybrid cloud is just AWS admitting public cloud isn't good enough. Skeptical approach. True or false? Discuss.
Absolutely false. Because the infrastructure that AWS has put in many of these regions, their global regions, is very robust, right? So it's not that they do not have they don't meet the requirement, and that's why we are bringing them here, right? The reason we are bringing them here is to improve various services, right? Is to bring the infrastructure closer to the customer, right? Not because there is anything lagging there.
Okay.
So that's an important factor. It is not being done because there is some limitation in region, right? Region, or let's say AWS infrastructure in Singapore, Malaysia, and the neighboring countries provides a robust infrastructure. Having said that, it does not give you data sovereignty, right? Which is a very critical factor for any country, right? So we are not doing this because there is some issue with the region. We are doing this to protect ourselves, right? To ensure that the Brunei's presence on the digital roadmap enhances, right? And we sort of climb up in that ladder.
This is not a firefighting exercise.
Absolutely
This is
not.
definitely just an improvement of the entire digital infrastructure and more control over our own data centers. I am understanding this. I appreciate that, Gaurav. Amalina, as the business development manager, you obviously have to have a lot of conversations. It sounds expensive, but it sounds extremely valuable. So in terms of when you talk to a CIO versus the CFO, who's the main person you have to convince on this solution?
I don't think it's one or the other. It's really both. I think they have to be aligned in what they want for their business. And definitely the CIO, when we bring this solution, when we have the conversation about the solution itself, they're very, they understand it immediately, like why would it work for their business or why they might have other options that they would prefer. But from the CFO's perspective, it's slightly different. So they have a few other considerations that they would be looking at other than the tech itself, which is probably surrounding cost, the cost of what it might be now versus the longer term costs. So for example, when they start to scale up, what does that look like for them in terms of when they use cloud versus what they're currently using? And the second is in terms of probably the less obvious costs would be like your costs around like risk and compliance issues when anything crops up with that. Whereas in this case, AWS actually manages a fair part of that by by solving your data residency issues and also by complying to certain standards.
Just curious, currently Comquest acts as the middle person between AWS and Brunei Enterprise and government. Would we be able to go directly to AWS, or already in itself you are solving that problem for us? Are there options around it?
Yes. So I'll tie this question with what Amalina was also answering around the cost. Today, if someone wants to, let's say, have an infrastructure which is even equivalent to what AWS provides, you will have to invest a lot of capital, right? A very critical factor when we have these conversations with the CFO, right? I'm a new startup. I want to launch my new tech application or something new. I will have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get the infrastructure, right? Now, one very, I would say, tectonic difference in this particular service is that you don't have to invest any capital. When we approach our customers, and that's where CFOs are the ones who love us most, right? Because they don't have to invest capex, right? What they do is they only subscribe to this as a service, right? So, in fact, if I relate it back to your previous question about racks, when people think of racks, they think of millions of dollars going in there, right? In this case, they don't invest anything at all. So zero capex. The whole business for a customer will run on OPEX. And that also they will pay from the time they actually go live, from the time their services, their revenue starts flowing in, right? Basically, their workloads move to our AWS. So this becomes a very important factor for CFOs to consider, right? How much money can I save on my balance sheet, right? And that obviously translates into profits and all of those things, right? So these conversations, sometimes CIOs are a little worried about the technology and the complexity and all of those. CFOs bite into this very fast.
Well, you've taken away that whole challenging area from them. And that's what you will manage.
True. You don't have to worry about the logistics of servers flying from somewhere and then setting up and this and that. All of that goes away. You just subscribe to hardware as a service.
It's a win-win so far.
Yes.
Good at the sales pitch. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, sometimes in Brunei we feel the internet's on hibernation mode or vacation. We're very sensitive to what the internet is doing. I want to ask you, Gaurav, how does the solution still work when, for example, our links to Singapore may be on the blink?
Yeah. Thankfully, that doesn't happen that often. So, it's great that infrastructure is quite stable. But having said that, it's always a possibility. Now, the good thing with AWS Outpost is because it is locally hosted, and because the local network or the local customers will be connected to it locally, we are actually quite insulated from Singapore, right? Now, an important feature of AWS is that all your workloads, all your applications can run in the local outpost. There's only one connectivity that goes between the outpost and the main AWS, which is dependent on internet. Having said that, if, let's say, God forbid, if that does happen, that there is a complete blackout, the outpost on its own can continue to run till the time internet is back. So customers here would actually not feel anything. They will continue to enjoy the services. Only thing they may not be able to see is something which is called as a central command or central panel, right? Control panel, which the users don't care about. It's only IT folks like us who care about that, right? So users don't get impacted. Users continue to run their applications without any impact. And the moment internet is back, it all goes back to normal. So the idea is, in a situation like this, your users should not even feel something happened.
Is it like, Gaurav, having a big electrical grid and then this is the generator? Could that be an analogy for it?
So there is a big electrical grid and there is a smaller version of electrical grid.
The generator.
Yeah. So yeah, you can call it generator.
Something
right?
like
so even
that.
if the electrical grid goes down, generator automatically picks up.
We love that. I remember when there was that big blackout and there was a huge impact on businesses and everyday life. So this is something that would have been great back then. Amalina, as you pitch the idea to either the CIOs or the CFOs, is there a point in time during the presentation when they're literally jaw-dropping impressed?
Okay. I think generally in the meetings that I've been in, the reception is fairly stoic when we're talking about like technical things, but you can tell when they've sort of bought into the idea when you share with them actually how easy it is to get started with AWS Outposts, because I think the thought of migrating their current workloads over to the new to AWS Outposts might be somewhat daunting at first. Like, where do we start and how do we start? And I think the good thing about that is that Comquest is here to actually bring them through the journey with them. So we will be with them from the start, discovery phase, all the way to the end when we actually migrate over and provide support for the services.
Anything to add on to that, Gaurav, in terms of IT people and their jaws dropping or trying not to drop?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the, as Amalina said, right? Some of the folks who think this is too technical, and also obviously they find it difficult to grasp till. And typically these meetings, we also try to keep it simple. We do not give out all the facts in one go, right? Simply because it will just overwhelm the customer. Now, where we see the shift happening is when you tell the IT folks that you don't have to come for that night shift, and miss out a particular occasion or, during Raya and all of those things. That feels, as I said, it gives them sort of a sense of peace and relaxation, right? That I don't have to worry about the infrastructure going down. For C folks, for C-suites, it's usually about when they look at our proposal, right? When they see that their total cost of ownership, which today is just, it's eating away from their bottom line, when that component moves away, right? And it becomes part of their direct cost of running business, right? Which means a lot of the cost moves from CAPEX to OPEX. That makes them very happy, not just CFO, ultimately CEOs as well, right? So those are the things when we tell them. We also tell them that, you do not have to invest so much of capital upfront. So the infrastructure can grow as you grow. Right. A lot of the times companies face the challenge that, they need to invest so much, take a lot of risk, right, in investing without knowing what the market dynamics will play out. Whereas in this case, you don't have to do a lot of things upfront. You grow your infrastructure as you grow as a company.
And I think you mentioned that earlier on as well, the power of scalability with the solution as well, which everybody appreciates, taking baby steps as we need to. Obviously, we have to have a conversation about AI. We are obsessed now with generative AI. How does this help us? Does it help us without breaking any data sovereignty rules?
It's a very important element. Today, everyone wants to talk about AI in everything, right? Without really seeing very many meaningful use cases, right, beyond Gen AI. That is only because we are still probably in an early phase of AI, right? The potential that we see is much bigger. And how the Outpost will tie into that is, today, if I want to use any of the AI models, I need to go to ChatGPT or any of those folks who are hosted somewhere else in the world. In future, let's say the Brunei businesses and the government wants to tap into that. They would again want to keep AI onshore. They would want to keep the data within country, because some of it could be critical data. Now that is where Outposts makes a very interesting debut, right? Because using the infrastructure that we are setting up for AWS Outposts, we can just add in the AI capability horizontally. What it means is you do not have to invest from scratch, right? Which is what a lot of countries have to do for their AI capability, right? It's the same infrastructure, you just add the scalability onto it to run your AI models, right? So what we did as part of our feasibility study when we were setting up AWS Outpost, we sort of tried discussing with our service providing partners here as to what level of upshot we have in this infrastructure. And now what we realized internally, again these are things that we have not obviously published, is that at least for the next 3 to 5 years of AI demand that we foresee, we should be able to cater it with the infrastructure we are setting up, right? By just adding smaller, modular components onto it. So again, translating this into what the end customers will see is that the customers who want to run sovereign AI models, they want to run their own LLM models in Brunei, they can do it using Outpost without having to worry about, your data training models outside of Brunei, which is obviously a sovereign risk.
So there is a supercharged element to how Bruneian users can experience generative AI with a solution.
Yes.
That's when jaws will quietly drop, Amalina. In terms of the naysayers, if you can share with me now, and I'm going back to your conversations with people as you go through this with them, is there a number one objection that will come up over and over again?
As I was saying earlier, so I'll just elaborate on that point because I think it's quite closely linked. In terms of what is probably the biggest hurdle at the beginning is those opening conversations where it's quite clear what the benefits of AWS are. So we've repeatedly touched on data sovereignty, latency, compliance. So those advantages are quite clear when we go in. It's more so how and when can we get started. So it's those conversations where we reassure them on two aspects of support that they'll have, right? One is from us, where we actually provide the on-the-ground local support, bringing them from the start of their journey all the way to the end. And the second part that also brings confidence is that the actual hardware itself is being fully managed by AWS.
If I could just add to that point, I think one objection which is sometimes implicit in the questions asked by customers, it's not very explicit, is the loss of control, right? Today I have my data center, the bare metal that I can see, I can open a door and go into my data center. Suddenly you are taking that away and putting it somewhere else, even though within Brunei, right? So some of the folks feel that they are losing control, right? So how we handle those objections is saying that, in today's day and age, the way you access your infrastructure is through those control panels. You have access to all of this information. You get something much more fancier than what you have today with AWS, right? The control panel that you have access to as a customer is so elaborate, and it gives you so much more information that today, just by looking at your hardware, you cannot get. Right. So once we tell them, and we have started sort of engaging with customers in trying to train them, trying to give them access to those control panels, and they find it very easy.
How interesting. The very thing that gives them convenience at the same time is comforting for them. Yep. Their physical presence of the server racks, you're taking that away, but giving them so much more is the next step of the conversation. Yep. I want to go back, Gaurav. You mentioned, and it's something I connected with, how important this kind of solution is within different industries. You brought up healthcare. This isn't a conversation for every business, every kadai runchit. Who are you specifically offering this to in terms of industries?
So as a service, AWS, we are open for anyone, right? Having said that, we will have to do a classification of the kind of customers that we would want to address first as a priority, because there is a limited capacity that we are bringing in as a start, right? We will be scaling as the capacity uptake happens. Now, initially, obviously, we are looking at customers, as you said, from healthcare, from oil and gas, from government sectors, from other private sectors who have fairly large application infrastructure, who are running multiple applications. A nuance there is, what we are offering is definitely AWS Outpost, but there are customers who may not even have started their cloud journey at all. Forget about whether it is in Singapore or Brunei. So as Comquest, we are also offering that service. So let's say, as you mentioned, Kadai Runchit, right? Let's say a bakery or a company who's currently running a small server and hosting their websites and other applications there. Instead of managing that, we could tell them we'll take all of this to AWS in the region, right? Your cost will dramatically come down there. Right, you don't have to necessarily run on Outpost, right? Because there's no critical or data sovereign or sovereignty related data. So we offer that service as well, where we'll take the customer from their on-premise, very legacy type, running of infrastructure. We take them to the AWS public region, which is Singapore, Malaysia, or other places. The moment you hit a critical mass as a customer and you think that your data is very sovereign, critical, latency becomes an issue, then we bring it to Outpost, right? So those are the two broad classifications. There could be a third one, right? Where a customer may say that, I have some set of data which is not very critical, right? And I'm okay for it to run in the region. But there's some amount of data which is very critical, which I cannot, let it leave the shores of Brunei. We can do both. Right? So that's why we call it hybrid setup, where some amount of data which is not critical runs in the region. The data which is critical runs here. Both can talk to each other and run seamlessly. Right? Why customer would want to do that is because when you run this whole service in the region, it is obviously more cost optimized because you are running in a huge setup where AWS has invested. Whereas if you run the infrastructure locally, obviously there is a small premium attached to it. Right, so that's how we sort of we'll categorize the customers and which customer will go in which segment.
So at the moment, Gaurav, this conversation will benefit people in the bigger industries, so healthcare, banking, even media, education,
Absolutely.
Perhaps.
Absolutely.
So then we'll start to drill down and find solutions for everybody, even on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Scalability, I like that. Let's go now as we fast forward 5 years. Gaurav, what does a fully Outpost-powered Bruneian enterprise look like in 2030?
Frankly, I would say that it should become a very boring conversation. Right?
And that's a good thing.
It's a good thing because the moment the folks in the IT industry or in the digital transformation industry, they have to stop worrying about the infrastructure, it becomes boring, it becomes business as usual, and it becomes a facility which is just readily available to them, right? So what I foresee is that the way we will scale AWS Outposts is that it will have access, everyone in Brunei will have access to it, right? And onboarding yourselves into AWS Outposts will become very easy, right? Like doing any other activity in Brunei. So it becomes boring and it becomes business as usual. And the expectation of customers and the residents in Brunei will keep going up, right? They will expect better and better infrastructure. While doing that, companies like ours will not have to worry about infrastructure. Government will not have to worry about infrastructure because we will be sitting behind silently and providing that at scale. Right? So that's how we foresee this evolving over the next 5 years.
And that's interesting. They said that when something is just so good and solves such a problem, there's no need to have any juicy conversations around it. It is just another day.
Yeah.
And that's where we want to get to in 2013. We're bringing our conversation to a close shortly. But Amalina, if there was one particular killer user case, and we've discussed the different industries and what the big plan is in terms of everybody having access to this, what would you say makes one killer use case that makes Brunei uniquely perfect for Outposts?
So one killer use case would probably be national scale regulated centralized systems. For example, like what we have in payments or finance or healthcare. And the reason why it's quite unique in terms of Brunei is because it's quite clear the data sovereignty requirements in some of these industries. And the second part is also because we have a few central systems that are important. So those are the ones that we would like to actually target.
So again, we've been now identifying where we begin in terms of educating people and where the most benefits comes in. That's pretty big picture stuff. And eventually, Gaurav, in 5 years' time, we're going to be so bored of this because it's just another day with us and AWS. Okay, final question. Both of you, Gaurav and Amalina together. This is a lightning round closing out. We'll begin with Amalina. If you're ready for this, in just one sentence, Amalina, why should every Bruneian CIO care about Comquest Outpost services in 2026?
We're bringing you something that's local, fast, and scalable.
3 things. We'll remember that. Gaurav, over to you. Lightning round.
As you grow your revenue, you need to watch out for the cost. And I'm talking directly to the CEOs. And as you do that, AWS is your partner on the journey.
So I can see that on a t-shirt on the front and on the back. AWS is part of your journey. With that, we'd like to thank Amalina so much and Gaurav so much from Comquest as we bring to our close our conversation on this true milestone in terms of technical and digital infrastructure and all it means for local industries, businesses, and eventually individuals in terms of data sovereignty, our compliance, and our latency. Thank you so much to Comquest, Gaurav, and Amalina.
The Kristal Media Podcast Network.